Your breath moves through you right now. Not because you command it, but because something deeper than thought sustains this body, this moment, this strange experience of being alive. And in this breath, a question arrives, not from outside, but from within the very fabric of your awareness. What if everything you believe about yourself is a carefully constructed lie? Not a malicious deception, not a conscious fraud, but a survival mechanism so sophisticated, so seamlessly woven into the texture of your daily experience, that you've mistaken the costume for your skin. You've been performing a role so long that you've forgotten you're performing. The character you play in the world, competent, composed, acceptable, has become so convincing that even you believe it. Especially you. But something is stirring beneath the performance. A restlessness. A quiet desperation that no achievement silences, no relationship satisfies, no distraction fully numbs. If you're feeling this, if some part of you recognizes what I'm describing, then perhaps you're ready to see what you've been avoiding. Not tomorrow. Not when you're more prepared. Now. Because the cost of continuing to hide from yourself is becoming unbearable. And you know it. Before we go deeper, I want to invite you to something. Not as an interruption, but as an acknowledgement. If this resonates, if you sense you're standing at a threshold, subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but for yourself. Mark this moment. Let it be a commitment to your own awakening. Because what follows will ask something of you that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The door is opening. You can feel it. What lies beyond is not comfort, but truth. And truth, when finally faced, is the only thing that sets you free. Before language, before the word "I" had any meaning, you existed as pure responsiveness. A nervous system receiving the world without interpretation. Warmth meant safety. Cold meant danger. The presence of another body meant survival. Their absence meant terror. You didn't think these things. You were these things. Then came the learning. Not through instruction, but through the subtle architecture of approval and withdrawal. When you expressed certain emotions, faces softened. Voices cooed. Arms reached. When you expressed others, the room temperature dropped. Eyes looked away. Bodies stiffened. Your nervous system, exquisitely attuned to threat, began mapping the terrain of acceptability. Anger made them uncomfortable. You learned to swallow it. Neediness made them withdraw. You learned to perform independence. Sadness burdened them. You learned to smile through pain. Desire embarrassed them. You learned to want nothing. Not consciously, not deliberately, but with the precision of an organism adapting to its environment, you began editing yourself. Pruning away the parts that threatened connection. Cultivating the parts that secured belonging. This wasn't weakness. This was intelligence. This was survival. Carl Jung called this construction the persona, the mask we wear to meet the demands of society. But he understood something most people miss. The persona isn't pathology. It's necessity. It allowed you to function, to be accepted, to survive a world that couldn't hold the fullness of what you were. The problem isn't that you built a mask. The problem is that you forgot you were wearing one. Years passed. The adaptation became automatic. The performance became seamless. You learned which version of yourself opened doors, earned praise, avoided punishment. You refined it, perfected it, until the constructed self felt more real than the raw, unedited consciousness that preceded it. But something happened to the parts you couldn't express. The rage that wasn't allowed, the hunger that was too demanding, the wildness that was too unpredictable, the vulnerability that was too dangerous. They didn't disappear. They sank, down into the basement of your psyche, where they continued to live, continued to grow, continued to exert force on your life. But now from the shadows, where you couldn't see them, couldn't name them, couldn't integrate them. Jung called this the shadow. Not evil, not pathological. Simply, everything you had to reject in order to become acceptable. And here's what nobody tells you. The shadow doesn't weaken with neglect. It ferments. It intensifies. It finds indirect routes to expression, through sudden outbursts you can't explain, through judgments of others that feel disproportionately intense, through dreams that disturb you, through attractions that shame you, through symptoms your doctors can't diagnose. You've been living a divided life. The persona facing the world, performing competence. The shadow lurking beneath, pressing against the walls of your carefully managed existence. And you're exhausted. Not the exhaustion that sleep fixes. The existential exhaustion of maintaining a fiction. Of monitoring every word, every gesture, every impulse to ensure nothing unacceptable leaks through. Of being perpetually on guard against your own nature. You feel it in your body. The chronic tension in your shoulders, as if you're bracing against some invisible threat. The tightness in your chest, as if you're holding your breath through life. The knot in your stomach that you've learned to call normal. This is the cost of the persona. This is the price of acceptability. And you're beginning to sense, perhaps not in words, but in the quiet desperation that wakes you at 3 in the morning, that something fundamental must change. The mask that saved you is now suffocating you. The adaptation that allowed you to survive is now preventing you from living. The persona that earned you belonging is now the primary source of your loneliness, because nobody knows who you actually are, including you. You've built a life around this constructed self. Relationships that depend on you remaining consistent with the character you've been playing. Career choices that reflect who you thought you should be, not who you are. Habits and patterns designed to maintain the illusion of control. And beneath it all, the shadow grows restless. It wants recognition. It wants integration. It wants to come home. But you've been taught to fear it, to pathologize it, to believe that if you let it surface, you'll be revealed as fundamentally flawed, unworthy, unlovable. So you double down on the performance. You work harder at being good, being successful, being spiritual, being whatever version of acceptable you've committed to. You meditate to transcend the darkness. You affirm to override the doubt. You achieve to prove your worth. But the unease persists. The anxiety without clear cause. The depression without obvious reason. The sense that despite everything you've accomplished, something essential is missing. You are living at a distance from yourself. And that distance is the source of your suffering. Not because you're broken. Not because you're doing it wrong. But because wholeness requires the integration of what you've been taught to reject. Authenticity demands the inclusion of what you've been conditioned to exile. The persona cannot become more sophisticated. It can only become more exhausting. The only way forward is through the fear, through the shame, through the carefully constructed walls that separate you from the fullness of your own being. This is the recognition phase. Not yet the solution, but the acknowledgement. The moment when you stop pretending the exhaustion is normal, the anxiety is just your personality, the depression is simply brain chemistry. The moment when you admit, I've been hiding from myself, and the hiding is killing me. You're standing at a threshold. Behind you, the familiar prison of the persona. Ahead, the unknown territory of integration. The choice is yours. But understand, not choosing is also a choice. And the cost of that choice compounds with every passing year. Something in you knows this. Something deeper than fear, deeper than conditioning, deeper than the voice that insists you must remain acceptable at all costs. That something is calling you home. Not to transcendence, not to perfection, but to the messy, complicated, fully human experience of being whole. The question is, will you answer? The exhaustion you feel isn't laziness. It isn't lack of discipline or insufficient self-care. It's the metabolic cost of maintaining a divided self. Every moment of every day, beneath conscious awareness, your psyche is working, monitoring, filtering, ensuring that nothing unacceptable surfaces, that no forbidden emotion leaks through, that the persona remains intact. This vigilance is invisible to you, but your body knows. Your nervous system knows. The tension in your jaw from words you didn't speak. The shallow breathing from emotions you didn't feel. The chronic inflammation from rage you didn't express. The insomnia from a life you're not actually living. These aren't random symptoms. They're intelligent signals. Your body is trying to tell you something your mind refuses to hear. You cannot continue like this. But you've been trained to pathologize these signals. To call them anxiety disorder, depression, chronic fatigue, autoimmune disease. To medicate them, manage them, transcend them, anything but listen to them. What if they're not malfunctions? What if they're messengers? What if your anxiety isn't a chemical imbalance, but your psyche's alarm system screaming that you're living a lie? What if your depression isn't a serotonin deficiency, but the soul's refusal to continue animating a life that isn't yours? I'm not suggesting you abandon medical care. I'm suggesting you consider that the body speaks in symptoms when the mind refuses to listen to truth. And the truth is this: you are exhausted because you are at war with yourself. The persona insists on control. The shadow demands expression. And you, caught between them, spend your energy trying to maintain a peace that isn't possible through suppression. You've tried everything to make the discomfort go away. Therapy that taught you to manage symptoms, but not integrate shadow. Meditation that promised transcendence, but delivered spiritual bypassing. Self-help that offered techniques, but not transformation. And still, the unease persists. Because the solution isn't more sophisticated management. It's surrender to what you've been avoiding. Here's the paradox that will either liberate you or terrify you. The very qualities you've rejected often contain your deepest power. The anger you learn to suppress? It holds your capacity for necessary boundaries, for self-protection, for saying no to what violates you. The selfishness you were taught to shame? It contains your will to live, your capacity to claim space, to prioritize your own needs without collapsing into guilt. The desire you learned to repress? It holds your authentic passion, your creative fire, your connection to what makes you feel alive. But you can't access these powers while you're still rejecting the shadow that contains them. You can't integrate what you refuse to acknowledge. You can't reclaim what you're still calling evil. So you remain weak where you could be strong, passive where you could be assertive, numb where you could be alive. Not because you lack these qualities, but because you've exiled them to the darkness, where they can't be refined, can't be integrated, can't serve your actual life. The shadow isn't absent. It's not dormant. It's fermenting in the dark, growing more primitive, more reactive, more desperate for recognition. And it will find expression, not through conscious choice, but through the cracks in your carefully constructed persona, through the sudden rage that shocks you, the attraction that shames you, the judgment that reveals you, the dream that disturbs you, the slip of the tongue that exposes you. These aren't accidents. They're eruptions. The shadow pressing through the walls you've built to contain it. And each time it happens, you feel the terror of being revealed, of being seen as you actually are, not as you've been pretending to be. So you reinforce the walls, strengthen the vigilance, double down on the performance. But the pressure builds, the cost increases, the exhaustion deepens, until you reach the point where you are now, unable to continue as you have been, but terrified to change. This is the breakdown that precedes breakthrough, the crisis that forces the question you've been avoiding. What if I stopped fighting myself? Consider the person who triggers you most intensely, the one whose presence makes your blood pressure rise, whose qualities you judge with particular venom, whose very existence seems to offend something deep within you. Now consider this. You are looking at your own shadow in a mirror. The arrogance you despise in them. You've rejected your own confidence. The neediness you judge in them. You've exiled your own vulnerability. The aggression you condemn in them. You've suppressed your own power. This is projection. Not a concept. A mechanism. The psyche's way of showing you what you refuse to see in yourself by displaying it on the screen of another person. Every intense judgment is a confession. Every disproportionate reaction is a revelation. Every person you hate is teaching you about the parts of yourself you've disowned. But you don't want to see this, because seeing it would require admitting that you're not who you think you are, that the persona you've built is incomplete, that the shadow you've been running from is actually yours. So you continue to project, to judge, to maintain the illusion that the problem is out there, not in here. And the division deepens. The exhaustion intensifies. The symptoms multiply. You're at a crossroads. Not metaphorically. Actually. One path leads to continued fragmentation. More sophisticated management strategies. Better medications. More advanced spiritual practices. All designed to help you cope with a divided self, but none addressing the division itself. This path is familiar. Socially acceptable, well supported by industries built around symptom management rather than integration. But it leads nowhere. Or rather, it leads to a life of increasing constriction, where more and more of your energy goes toward maintaining the persona, and less remains for actually living. The other path leads through the shadow, through the fear, through the shame, through everything you've been taught to avoid. This path is unfamiliar, socially unsupported, actively discouraged by a culture that prefers managed symptoms to integrated wholeness. But it leads to freedom. Not the freedom of transcendence, but the freedom of inclusion. The freedom of finally being able to stop fighting yourself. The freedom of wholeness. The choice seems obvious when stated this way, but the fear is real, because you don't know who you'll be on the other side of integration. You don't know if people will still accept you. You don't know if you'll still recognize yourself. And so you hesitate, caught between the unbearable present and the unknown future. But something is shifting. You can feel it. The walls are cracking. The persona is failing. The shadow is rising. Not as catastrophe, but as opportunity. The breakdown you've been dreading might actually be the breakthrough you've been needing. The crisis you've been avoiding might be the doorway you've been seeking. What if instead of fighting this moment, you surrendered to it? What if instead of reinforcing the walls, you let them fall? What if instead of transcending the shadow, you you finally turn to face it. This is the invitation. Not comfortable, not safe, but real. The question is no longer whether you'll face your shadow. The question is whether you'll do it consciously, with awareness and intention, or whether you'll wait until it forces itself through in ways you can't control. The shadow will be integrated, one way or another. The only choice is whether you participate in the process or become its victim. There is a place within you that you've been avoiding. Not a metaphorical place. An actual territory of your psyche that you've learned to navigate around, to never quite look at directly, to sense only in peripheral vision. You know it's there. You've always known. It's the place where the forbidden emotions live, where the unacceptable desires dwell, where the parts of you that couldn't be integrated into the persona have been waiting, growing, intensifying in the darkness. This is not imagination. This is recognition. Right now, as you hear these words, you can feel it. A stirring, a presence, something ancient and familiar and utterly yours that you've been pretending doesn't exist. The shadow wears many faces, but they're all your face. It speaks in many voices, but they're all your voice. It is the rage you've been calling frustration. Not anger rage. The primal, untamed force that wants to destroy what threatens you, that refuses to be diminished, that will not be silenced. You've been taught to fear this rage, to pathologize it, to believe that if you let it surface, you'll become violent, destructive, uncontrollable. But rage isn't violence. Rage is power. Unrefined, yes. Primitive, yes. But power nonetheless. The power to say no. The power to establish boundaries. The power to protect what matters. You rejected it because it wasn't acceptable. And in rejecting it, you rejected your own capacity for self-protection. You became someone who can be violated without response. Someone who swallows injustice. Someone who turns anger inward until it becomes depression. The shadow is also the greed you've been calling ambition. Not the socially acceptable desire for success, but greed. The raw, unapologetic hunger for more. For pleasure. For resources. For life itself. You've been taught that this hunger is shameful. That wanting too much makes you selfish. That true spirituality requires transcending desire. But greed isn't pathology. Greed is life force. The organism's fundamental drive to survive, to thrive, to expand. Without it, you become passive, resigned. Someone who accepts scraps and calls it humility. The shadow contains your lust. Not the sanitized version called healthy sexuality, but lust. Raw, demanding, undomesticated. You've been taught to be ashamed of this. To hide it. To express it only in approved contexts, in approved ways, with approved intensity. But lust is vitality. It's the body's insistence on pleasure, on connection, on the ecstatic experience of being alive in flesh. Without it, you become numb, disconnected. Someone going through the motions of intimacy without ever actually feeling it. The shadow holds your despair. Not the manageable sadness you allow yourself, but despair. The bottomless grief. The existential horror. The recognition of mortality, meaninglessness, the fundamental aloneness of existence. You've been running from this your entire life. Distracting yourself. Constructing meaning. Believing in progress. Anything to avoid the void. But despair is truth. It's the honest recognition of the human condition. And paradoxically, it's only by facing this despair that you can discover the joy that doesn't depend on denial. The peace that includes suffering. The meaning that emerges from meaninglessness. The shadow contains your shame. Not guilt about specific actions, but shame. The core belief that you are fundamentally flawed, unworthy, unlovable. You've been trying to overcome this shame through achievement, through goodness, through spiritual practice. But you can't transcend what you won't acknowledge. Shame isn't something to fix. It's something to feel. Fully. Without defense. Until you discover that you can survive it. That it doesn't destroy you. That on the other side of shame is the recognition that worthiness isn't earned. It simply is. Now here's what you need to understand. Every person you judge with intensity, every quality you condemn with passion, every weakness you despise in others, you are looking at your own shadow in a mirror. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you? You've rejected your own confidence, your own right to take up space, your own capacity to believe in yourself without apology. The friend whose neediness exhausts you? You've exiled your own vulnerability, your own desire for connection, your own human requirement for support. The public figure whose aggression disgusts you? You've suppressed your own power, your own capacity for impact, your own willingness to fight for what matters. This is projection. The psyche's ingenious mechanism, for showing you what you refuse to see in yourself. Every judgment is a confession. Every criticism is a revelation about what you've disowned. But here's the paradox that changes everything. The qualities you've rejected don't just contain problems. They contain power. The rage you suppressed? It holds your capacity for necessary boundaries, for self-protection, for refusing what violates you. Without it, you become someone who can be endlessly exploited, endlessly diminished, endlessly violated, and you'll call it compassion. The greed you shamed? It contains your will to live, your capacity to claim resources, your willingness to prioritize your own survival. Without it, you become someone who accepts poverty, who settles for scraps, who believes that wanting more makes you bad. The lust you repressed? It holds your authentic passion, your creative fire, your connection to what makes you feel alive. Without it, you become someone going through the motions, performing intimacy, wondering why nothing feels real. The despair you avoided? It contains your capacity for genuine joy. Because only by facing the void can you discover the meaning that doesn't depend on denial. Only by accepting mortality can you fully inhabit life. The shame you buried? It holds your humanity, your capacity for genuine connection. Because only by accepting your own flaws can you stop performing perfection and finally let yourself be known. This is the invitation to integration. Not to act out every impulse, not to become your shadow, but to finally acknowledge it, to bring it into consciousness, to let it come home. What if instead of fighting these parts, instead of transcending them, instead of managing them, you simply let them be? What if the rage could exist without needing to destroy? What if the greed could exist without needing to consume? What if the lust could exist without needing to violate? What if the despair could exist without needing to overwhelm? What if these forces, when acknowledged and integrated, become sources of power rather than sources of shame? The shadow doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be recognized, included, given a seat at the table of your consciousness. Because wholeness isn't the absence of darkness. Wholeness is the integration of light and shadow into a complete human being. You've been living as a fragment, calling it a self. You've been performing a role, calling it a life. You've been managing symptoms, calling it healing. But true transformation requires something more radical. The willingness to meet what you've been avoiding, to face what you've been fleeing, to integrate what you've been rejecting. This isn't comfortable. It isn't safe. It isn't what you've been taught to do. But it's the only way home, the only way to wholeness, the only way to finally stop fighting yourself and start living as a complete human being. The shadow is rising, not as enemy but as ally, not as threat but as teacher, not as darkness to be eliminated, but as the missing half of your own being, finally demanding recognition. The question is, will you turn to face it, or will you continue to run until it forces itself through in ways you can't control? The choice, as always, is yours. But the cost of continued avoidance is becoming unbearable. And somewhere deep within you, you know it. What if, in this moment, you simply stopped? Stopped defending. Stopped managing. Stopped maintaining the elaborate story of who you're supposed to be. Not as defeat. As experiment. As curiosity about what remains when the performance ends. Feel the breath moving through this body. Not your breath, breath itself, happening without your control, without your permission, without your identity being involved at all. The heart beats. Did you decide that? Are you maintaining it? Or is something larger than the small self operating this organism, sustaining this life, continuing this existence without consulting the persona you've been defending? There are thoughts arising right now. Can you notice them? Not think them, notice them, as if they're weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness. I am thinking assumes an I that owns the thoughts. But what if thoughts simply arise? What if the I that claims them is itself just another thought, just another pattern, just another construction? The boundaries of the self begin to soften, not as pathology but as recognition, like ice finally remembering its water, like a wave finally recognizing its ocean. The persona you've been defending, competent, composed, acceptable, starts to feel less like truth and more like costume. Not false exactly, but not fundamental, not who you actually are. And beneath the costume, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully constructed identity, what? Emptiness? Or spaciousness? Nothing? Or everything? There is an awareness that observes thoughts, but is not thoughts. That witnesses emotions, but is not emotions. That experiences sensations, but is not sensations. You've been so identified with the content of consciousness, the thoughts, the feelings, the stories, that you've missed the consciousness itself. the awareness in which all content arises. This awareness doesn't have a personality. It doesn't have preferences. It doesn't have a history or a future. It simply is. Present. Witnessing. Allowing. And you, not the persona, not the shadow, not the constructed self, you are that. Not as concept, as direct experience. Right now, the awareness reading these words is not the words. The presence experiencing this moment is not the content of the moment. You are the space in which experience happens, the sky in which weather moves, the silence in which sound occurs. This recognition doesn't make you special. It makes you nothing, and everything, simultaneously. Nothing, because the separate self you've been defending doesn't actually exist as a solid, continuous entity. It's a process, a pattern, a story the mind tells itself. Everything, because without the boundaries of the separate self, you are continuous with all of existence. Not metaphorically. Actually. The air you breathe was in someone else's lungs moments ago. The atoms in your body were in stars billions of years ago. The awareness witnessing this moment is the same awareness witnessing every moment, everywhere. For just an instant, the vastness recognizes itself. The ocean realizes it was never just a wave. The space understands it was never just the objects moving through it. This is ego dissolution, not as psychedelic experience, but as sober recognition. The constructed self, seen clearly, reveals itself as construction. And in that seeing, something shifts. But don't get lost in transcendence. Don't mistake this recognition for escape from the human condition. The body still breathes. The heart still beats. The organism still has needs, desires, fears. The personality still operates. The shadow still exists. Integration isn't about transcending these things. It's about recognizing that you are both the wave and the ocean, both the individual and the universal, both the constructed self and the awareness that witnesses it. You don't have to choose between them. You don't have to eliminate one to access the other. The persona isn't the enemy. It's a tool, a necessary interface between the vastness of what you are and the specific circumstances of this life. The shadow isn't the problem. It's the disowned half of your humanity, waiting to be integrated into wholeness. The ego isn't something to kill. It's something to see through, to recognize as process rather than entity, to hold lightly rather than defend desperately. This is the dissolution phase, not as permanent state, but as glimpse, as recognition, as the direct experience of what you are beneath the stories, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully constructed identity. And having seen it once, you can't fully unsee it. The persona will reassert itself. It must, to function in the world. The shadow will still require integration. The human challenges will continue. But something fundamental has shifted. You know now, in a way that can't be forgotten, that you are not only the wave. You're also the ocean. You are not only the constructed self. You are also the awareness in which that self arises. You are not only the content of consciousness. You are consciousness itself. The relief of this recognition is profound. Not because problems disappear, but because the one who was suffering them is revealed as less solid than you thought. The anxiety doesn't have to be eliminated. It can be witnessed. The depression doesn't have to be transcended. It can be held in awareness. The shadow doesn't have to be destroyed. It can be integrated, because you are the space in which all of this occurs. And space is never threatened by what moves through it. The sky is never damaged by storms. The ocean is never diminished by waves. This is freedom, not from the human condition, but within it. Not as escape, but as expansion. Not as transcendence, but as inclusion. You are both infinitely small and infinitely large. Both nothing and everything. Both the individual struggling through this life and the awareness that witnesses all lives. And the body breathes. The heart beats. The moment continues. You are here. You have always been here. You will always be here. Not the persona. Not the shadow. Not the constructed self. But this awareness. This presence, this inexplicable fact of being. Welcome home. The glimpse fades. It always does. The vastness contracts back into the particular. The ocean remembers itself as wave. The awareness becomes identified again with the content it witnesses. This isn't failure. This is how it works. You cannot remain in dissolution. You have a life to live, bills to pay, relationships to navigate, a body that requires food, shelter, care. A personality that interfaces with the world. The question isn't whether you'll return to the constructed self. You will. You must. The question is, having seen through it, can you hold it differently? Integration means bringing the shadow home without becoming it. Acknowledging the rage without letting it control you. Recognizing the greed without letting it consume you. Feeling the lust without letting it violate boundaries. Facing the despair without letting it overwhelm you. It means allowing these forces to exist within you, to inform you, to empower you, but not to possess you. The rage becomes discernment, the capacity to recognize violation and respond with appropriate force. Not reactive explosion, but conscious boundary setting. The greed becomes healthy self-interest, the willingness to claim resources, to prioritize your needs, to refuse the martyrdom that masquerades as virtue. The lust becomes authentic passion, the capacity to feel desire without shame, to pursue pleasure without guilt, to inhabit your body as a source of joy rather than a problem to manage. The despair becomes depth, the recognition of life's tragic dimension that makes joy more precious, connection more meaningful, existence more poignant. The shame becomes humility, not the false humility of self-diminishment, but the genuine humility of recognizing your humanity, flawed, limited, and worthy nonetheless. This is what integration looks like. Not perfection, not transcendence, but wholeness. The inclusion of all parts, light and shadow, into a complete human being. You will still have preferences, still have personality, still have patterns and habits and ways of being in the world, but you'll hold them more lightly, with less desperation, with more humor, because you've seen that the self you've been defending isn't as solid as you thought, that the persona you've been maintaining isn't who you fundamentally are, that the shadow you've been fleeing is actually yours, and integrating it doesn't destroy you, it completes you. The people in your life will notice something different. Not necessarily what, but they'll sense a shift. Less performance, more presence, less defense, more authenticity. Some will be relieved. Finally meeting the real you, not the carefully managed version. Finally experiencing genuine connection rather than strategic interaction. Others will be disturbed, because your integration challenges their own fragmentation. Your authenticity exposes their performance. Your wholeness reveals their division. This is not your problem to fix. You cannot integrate someone else's shadow. You cannot force someone else's awakening. You can only live your own truth and let it ripple outward. There will be moments when you forget, when you collapse back into identification with the persona, when you react from shadow rather than respond from integration, when you lose touch with the awareness that witnesses it all. This is normal. This is human. This is the work. Integration isn't a destination you reach and then maintain effortlessly. It's a practice, a continual returning, a repeated recognition of what you are beneath the stories, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully constructed identity. Each time you forget, you can remember. Each time you contract, you can expand. Each time you identify with the wave, you can recognize the ocean. Not as spiritual achievement, as simple recognition, as obvious as noticing breath, as available as this present moment. The shadow work never ends. There are always deeper layers, always more subtle forms of self-deception, always new ways the ego reasserts itself, now wearing spiritual clothing, now claiming to be integrated, now performing awakening. But you're learning to recognize the patterns, to catch yourself in the act of construction, to notice when you're defending rather than being, to feel when you're performing rather than living. And in that noticing, in that recognition, in that simple awareness, freedom emerges. Not as permanent state, but as repeated glimpse. Not as achievement, but as grace. You are learning to live as both wave and ocean, both individual and universal, both constructed self and witnessing awareness. This is the integration. This is the return. This is what it means to be fully human, shadow and light, persona and depth, performance and presence, all held within the spaciousness of awareness that you fundamentally are. So what now? What do you do with this recognition? You live. You continue. You engage with the world not as someone who has transcended it, but as someone who has finally agreed to fully inhabit it. You bring your integrated self to your relationships, not performing perfection, but offering authenticity, not hiding your shadow, but not acting it out unconsciously either. Present, real, whole. You bring your integrated self to your work, not as someone proving worth, but as someone expressing capacity. Not driven by shame or fear, but by genuine interest, by authentic passion, by the simple desire to contribute. You bring your integrated self to your solitude, not as escape from the world, but as return to source. Not as spiritual bypassing, but as genuine rest in the awareness that you are. The journey doesn't end. It deepens. There's always more to integrate, always more to recognize, always more to include in the expanding circle of what you're willing to acknowledge as yours. But something fundamental has shifted. You've stopped running from yourself. You've stopped fighting your own nature. You've stopped trying to transcend the human condition and started learning to fully inhabit it. This is the awakening, not as dramatic enlightenment experience, but as simple recognition. Not as escape from suffering, but as the willingness to include it. Not as transcendence of shadow, but as integration of it. You are whole. You have always been whole. The fragmentation was illusion. The division was construction. The war with yourself was unnecessary. And now, having recognized this, you can finally rest. Not in permanent peace. Life is too dynamic for that. But in the fundamental okayness of what you are. Flawed, limited, human, and whole. Before we close, I want to acknowledge what you've just experienced. If you've stayed with this, if you've allowed these words to penetrate, if you've felt the recognition stirring, you've done something most people avoid their entire lives. You've turned to face your shadow. You've questioned your constructed identity. You've glimpsed the awareness beneath the performance. This matters, not as achievement, but as beginning, as threshold, as the first step of a journey that will continue for the rest of your life. If this resonates, if you sense you're standing at the beginning of something significant, I invite you again. Subscribe to this channel. Not as passive consumption, but as active commitment. Mark this moment. Let it be a declaration that you're choosing integration over fragmentation, authenticity over performance, wholeness over division. And share this. Not to spread content, but to offer recognition. Because somewhere in your life, there's someone else standing at this same threshold. Someone else exhausted by the performance. Someone else ready to face their shadow. Someone else needing permission to stop fighting themselves. Your sharing might be the permission they need. Your recognition might trigger theirs. Your integration might inspire theirs. The work continues. The integration deepens. The recognition becomes more stable, more available, more obvious. But it starts here, with this moment, with this breath, with this simple willingness to see what you've been avoiding, to include what you've been rejecting, to integrate what you've been fighting. You are not broken. You never were. You were divided. And division, when recognized, can be healed. Not through transcendence, but through inclusion. Not through elimination, but through integration. The shadow is coming home. The persona is softening. The awareness is recognizing itself. And you, the real you, beneath the stories, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully constructed identity, you are finally becoming visible. To yourself, to others, to the world. This is the awakening. This is the integration. This is what it means to face your shadow and discover that on the other side of fear is not destruction, but wholeness. Welcome to the rest of your life. It won't be easier, but it will be real. And real, when finally chosen, is the only thing worth living. The breath continues. The heart beats. The moment unfolds. You are here. Whole. Complete. Exactly as you are. And that finally is enough. Let the words settle. Let the recognition deepen. Let the breath return you to this body, this moment, this inexplicable fact of being alive. You don't have to do anything with what you've heard. You don't have to fix anything, change anything, achieve anything. Simply notice. Simply recognize. Simply allow. The shadow is yours. The persona is yours. The awareness is yours. All of it. Included. Integrated. Whole. And when you're ready, not when you're perfect, not when you're fully integrated, but simply when you're ready, you can open your eyes and return to the world. Not as someone who has transcended it, but as someone who has finally agreed to fully inhabit it. Whole. Real. Alive. This is the work. This is the way. This is the only path home.